Hi everyone, Sean Wassell here. Building a one-off calendar component, as we've seen how to do, is one thing, but making that component so that it's actually reusable is quite another. Alright, so what we're going to be seeing how to do here is take the calendar that we've built and make it reusable to the point where we can make things like event tracker applications, date pickers, and so on with that same component. So this is going to involve really getting deep into the weeds with props and that sort of thing, and it's going to really improve your knowledge about reusable components in React as well. So without further ado, let's get started. Alright, so our first step in making our calendar component reusable is going to be to basically add some controls to it so that we can navigate between months, right? Our current functionality is a little bit limited because we're basically only able to display the current month, and that's just how we've designed it so far, right? That gave us a good starting point for actually creating a calendar that looks right, as we did here. But the next thing that we're going to do, as I said, is basically just add next and previous buttons up here next to the name. And these buttons will, well, basically they'll be on either side of this title, but these buttons will basically allow us to go forward and backward in the year, and they'll also take care of, switching between years, as in going to the next one when we're on December and we need to go to January of the following year. So that's going to be pretty straightforward to do. It's really just going to involve adding state to our calendar component and basically using that to interface with moment and display the proper month. So to get started here, let's open up our calendar. And as I mentioned, the first thing that we're going to do is import our useState hook. Okay, so we're going to say import useState from React. And now that we have this useState hook, what we're going to do is add some state to our calendar component that will basically determine what the current month is that we're going to display inside the calendar. So as we change months, this is also going to require us to recompute this weeks thing that gets displayed down in the JSX. You'll see how that works in just a minute. So first of all, though, just somewhat arbitrarily, what we're going to do is have our calendar start off by displaying the current month, and then allow users to navigate forward or backward from there. So what we're going to do is, instead of saying current month moment equals moment, and just getting, the current day that way, we're going to actually change this and say const today equals moment. And then for our current month moment, we're actually going to set that as a state variable. So we'll say const current month moment and set current month moment. And this is going to be equal to useState, and the initial value, as I said, is going to be today. So we're just going to use this today moment that we created and set that as the initial value of our state. And that's all we need to do to add state, right? So our calendar should look exactly like it did before, except now this current month is actually stored in state, which means that we'll be able to change it. All right, so in order to allow our users to change the month, we're going to add two buttons, and those two buttons are going to call two different functions, one for incrementing the month and one for decrementing the month. So let's just implement those functions right now. We'll say const increment month equals, and what this is going to do is increment the current month moment state by 1 month. Now it is important here to note that we can't just call current month moment.add 1 months. And the reason for this has to do with how React treats state and how React re-renders. Essentially, React will only re-render if it senses that the state is changing, and in order for that to happen, we need to call this set current month moment with a value that is not equal to the previous value. Now, the funny thing about moments, right, like today, or whatever moment object we have in the current month moment state, since moments are objects, if we just call the set function with this moment here, JavaScript will think that they're equal, right? Because they're the same object, and two objects are equal in JavaScript if they are, references to the same object in memory, which this one clearly is. So what we need to do is actually create a copy of our current month moment and set the current month moment state to that. So what that's going to look like is we need to say set current month moment, And then we're going to call the moment constructor again by saying moment current month moment dot add 1 months. Okay, and you could do current month moment dot add dot clone as well if you wanted to, but I kind of prefer the syntax of this way, so that's what we're going to do here. So let's now do the same thing for the decrement month function. What we're going to do there is say set current month moment to a new moment created from the current month moment minus 1 month. So subtract 1 months. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to have 2 buttons that will allow the user to actually call these 2 functions and change the month. So here, what we're going to do is say button on click equals decrement month. And this button will say previous, and then we'll have another button whose on click attribute will call the increment month function. And that will say next. All right, so let's take a look at this thing and see if it all works. We see that we have our 2 buttons here, and they're not super pretty at the moment, but we'll add some styling at some point. And we can see that by clicking these now, it actually changes months, and that if we go to December and go to the next month, it will automatically take care of switching that to January of the following year. Okay, and the previous button works as well. And as you can see, the calendar that we created before is really holding its own, right? It's displaying the first of the month on the correct day, and it's displaying the last of the month on the correct day, and properly filling the rest of the cells in this table. And that's how to add controls to a calendar component in React. All right, so now that we've added the previous and next buttons to our calendar, the next question that we have to ask ourselves is this component really as reusable as it could be? And I'm going to claim that the answer to that is no, and here's why. Basically, the way that our calendar is currently set up, we're very restricted with what we can do with it, right? The parent component that wants to display this thing really has no say in what month is being displayed at a given time, right? Our calendar component is basically just throwing its weight around and saying that, you know what, I'm going to start off on today, and if the user wants to get to any other month, then that's their problem. They can just click through the buttons until they get there. And, you know, if you wanted to navigate back in the calendar to 1999 or something like that, that's obviously not ideal. So essentially what we're going to want to do with this calendar component is allow it to accept the current month that it's displaying as a prop. So basically what we're going to do is add this as a prop. So we'll have something like current month moment. Right? And then the parent component is going to be the one that actually takes care of this state, which means that it's also going to have props for going to the next month, right? So we'll have a prop that's called something like go to next or go to previous. And those will actually change this current month moment state in whatever parent component this is. Now, this is actually a very common pattern in React applications, and it's something that's referred to as controlled components. Okay, controlled components. And basically what controlled components are components that just take props and don't have any kind of state inside of them, right? Essentially, they're components that could have their own state and where it would make sense at first to have that, as we've done in our calendar component here, but that for reusability reasons, we actually want to move that state up into whatever parent component is displaying our controlled component. And the same thing can be seen with forms, with modals, with lots of other very common user interface elements. And this is something that we'll take a look at in a lot more detail somewhere else. But for now, what we're going to do is essentially create another component, okay? And we'll call this component something like calendar controller.js. This component is going to contain the state, okay? So it'll have a use state hook that will contain the current moment that we're displaying on the calendar, right, for the month that we're displaying in the calendar. And it'll also have the increment and decrement month functions. Okay. And it's basically going to pass these down as props to the calendar. All right, so let's see what this is going to look like now in code. First of all, we're going to create our calendar controller component by saying export const calendar controller. This component isn't going to take any props for the time being. And it's also going to import our calendar component. And it will display it down here. So we'll say return, and we're going to say calendar. Now, what we're going to do next is we're basically going to move all of these state logic, right? That's including the increment month thing here, into our calendar controller. So we're basically just going to copy and paste it, and that includes today as well. So we're just going to copy that, paste it into here, and we're also going to do increment month and decrement month. And we're going to leave weeks, okay? So we'll put those two functions inside our calendar controller. And now, all we need to do is just add some props to our calendar component so that we can pass those things into it. So let's say calendar equals, and we're going to allow it to pass in current month moment. And we'll add two function props. One will be called on previous and on next. And that's going to be what we'll pass these two functions here to. So let's just do that now. We're just going to say current month moment equals current month moment. On previous equals decrement month. And on next equals increment month. Okay, and let's just adjust the indentation here a little bit, make it a little more readable. Okay, and then back in our calendar component, we need to change the current calls to increment and decrement month to on previous and on next. So let's say on click equals on previous, and on click equals on next. And that should be really all we need to do for now. Let's open up our app component now, and instead of displaying our calendar component, we're going to display our calendar controller. So we'll say calendar controller from calendar controller, and then we'll display that down here. And it looks like we also need to import some things into our calendar controller component, right? The things that we copied and pasted, we never imported the supporting libraries there, such as moment. So let's do that now. We're going to say import moment from moment. And we're going to also import the use state hook from React. And that should be all we need to do. Let's also remove those things from our calendar now, since we no longer need them. And what you can actually see is that our calendar component now has no outside dependencies that it's directly importing, right? Obviously, it uses the moment library indirectly because it gets passed a moment object as a prop here, but we're not actually importing anything currently into this file. Okay, so we should be able to use our application now just like before. All right, and we can see that everything works as before, except now our calendar component is a lot more flexible, since basically we can have the parent component, which is represented here by the calendar controller, but could be in theory any component that needs to use our calendar. The parent component can essentially implement whatever logic it wants now inside increment month, decrement month, and it can do whatever logic it wants with what month to start on as well. Okay, so if we wanted to do something like make a network request every time the user went to the next month, right? Or maybe we wanted to save the current month that they were looking at in local storage or something like that to persist our state, all we would have to do is just put that right inside this function here, okay? And likewise with decrement month, we could just put that logic right in here, and that would work just like we want it to. So essentially, our calendar component here, we've really removed a lot of its responsibilities, right? It's now really only responsible for figuring out how to generate the corresponding weeks and how to display them correctly for a given month. Okay, so we've made our calendar component nice and reusable now, but there's still a pretty insidious problem that we should really fix before moving on. Now, this problem mainly has to do with this word inside the current month moment prop, and that is moment. Now, what's wrong with this? Well, it's the name of a library, and really the way that we're using it inside this component forces whatever parent component is using the calendar to also use the moment library. So what's wrong with that? Well, it really makes it a lot more difficult to reuse this calendar component if, say, the parent component was using JavaScript's built-in date object, right? So when building reusable components, we almost never want to force the parent component to use a specific library in order to use the component, right? You can imagine if we were just building this reusable calendar component and wanted other developers working on other projects to be able to install it, they're not going to like that we have this moment thing and that we're forcing them to include the moment library in their project. So what we're going to see how to do here is make this component what I call library-agnostic, where it doesn't force the parent component to use anything. Now, keep in mind that we are still going to use the moment library both in the parent component, right, our calendar controller component here, and inside our calendar. But the main thing that we're going to do, right, the main change we're going to make is we're going to make it so that the interface between the two, which is the props here, doesn't force either side to use a specific library. So essentially what we're going to do is instead of having a current month moment prop, we're going to allow the parent component to pass in the year and the month as props. Okay, so this will give a nice clean interface between the two that doesn't force the parent component to use a specific library, right? It could use any library it wanted, or it could really not care about dates at all, right? It'll just have to pass in a year number, right, which will be like 2021, for example, and a month number, which would be, something like 8. All right, so let's see how to do this. The first thing that we're going to do is just that. We're going to remove this current month moment prop, and we're going to replace that with a prop called month number and a prop called year. Okay, and you can just change this to month if you want. In fact, I like it better as month. The point is it's going to be a number. We could always use prop types to express that if we wanted to. So the next thing that we're going to do now that we have the month and year is we need to actually create a moment from those inside our component, right? There's nothing wrong with using the moment library inside the component. We just don't want to force the parent component that's using it to also include the moment library. So what we're going to do to create a moment from that month and year, and to do that, we just need to say const current month moment equals moment, and we're going to insert a string that has both the month and the year. So we're going to say month and year, and we're going to basically tell moment how to parse that by saying month, month, year, 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 year. So essentially, if the user passes in, let's say, 10/2021, then this string here is going to be 10/2021, and moment will know how to parse that correctly. So the next thing that we need to do is go into our calendar controller and adjust it for the new interface that's between our calendar and its parent. So what this is going to look like is instead of passing the current month moment prop, which no longer exists on our calendar, we're going to have the month and the year. And to get both of those, we're going to say equals current month moment dot format, and we're just going to get the month displayed as So we're sort of serializing the month, if you will, into a number, passing it through calendar, and then our parent component doesn't really care what calendar does with it, but calendar is essentially, creating a moment from that string. So we're going to do the same thing with the year now. We're going to say year equals current month moment dot format, and we're going to say y. And if we go back and take a look at our application, first of all, we need to actually import moment library into our calendar component again. We're going to say import moment from moment. And now if we take a look at our application again, we should see that everything is still working as before, except now our calendar component is more flexible because it's not forcing its parent component to use any kind of specific library, right? It could be using, as I said, just the regular JavaScript date object, and as long as it can get the month and year in the correct format and pass those into the calendar, we would be all good, right? It would still work just as we want it to. All right, so now that we've made our calendar component quite reusable, your next question is probably something along the lines of, what are some other situations that we can use this calendar component in? And to demonstrate this and how reusable this calendar really is, what we're going to do is create another calendar controller that will actually use query parameters to keep track of what month we're on, in addition to a state variable. So first of all, let's talk about our basic strategy for using query parameters to select a month. Essentially what we're going to do is when the user visits our site, right? So if we're at localhost 3000, for example, the query parameters are the part of the URL that comes after a question mark, and basically each of them is just a name of some kind, right? So we can use month for whatever month we want to be on, followed by an equal sign, and then the value that we want to be at there. So this could be 8, for example. Okay, and then if we want to have multiple query parameters, we just separate those with an ampersand symbol. So we could have year equals 2021, for example. Okay, so essentially what we're going to have to do is we're first going to have to add a router to our application so that we'll be able to access these things. And the second thing we're going to have to do is create a new controller component that will actually find these two query parameters and set them whenever something changes. It's like when the user goes to the next month or to the previous month or whatever. Now, the advantage of using query parameters in this situation too is that our users will be able to copy and paste this entire URL and send it to a friend, let's say, and their friend will be able to see the exact same month and year, right? Their friend won't have to navigate to the correct month in order to see whatever you want to show them, right? The same thing happens on sites like Amazon, where you can actually search something, right? If you type something in the search bar like, I don't know, HDMI cables, and you find a really nice one, and you want to share this search with someone, that search is actually up in a query parameter in your URL, right? So it'll look something like that. It'll say search equals HDMI. They usually express spaces like plus or something like that. Cables. And essentially what you can do is just copy that URL and share it with your friend, and they'll be able to see your exact search that you made. So you don't have to tell them, go to Amazon, search for HDMI cables. You can just send that exact URL to them. Okay, so that's the advantage of using query parameters in this case. So what we're going to do is we're first of all going to open up our app component and add a router to it. So let's first of all install the React Router DOM package, which contains all of the components necessary for route-related stuff in React. And once that's installed, we're going to import something called Browser Router from React Router DOM, and we're just going to wrap our component in it right now. We're going to say Browser Router and put our calendar controller inside of it. Okay, and we're actually going to create a new calendar controller that will basically take care of loading and setting the query parameters as we just talked about. So let's create a new file. We're going to say something like query parameters calendar controller. Kind of a long name, but whatever, it gets the job done. And I'm just going to start off by copying and pasting our calendar controller here, and we'll be making a few additions to it. So first of all, what we need to do is instead of just automatically setting the moment to today, we're going to load the month and year query parameters from the URL. So I mentioned earlier that, you know, we might want to do something like year equals blah, 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 and month equals blah, blah, blah in the query parameters. But we can actually shorten that even further and just say y equals and m equals. This makes the URL shorter when our users are copying and pasting that in, let's say, Slack. Okay, so first of all, the way that we're going to get those parameters, we need to import a React hook called useLocation from our React Router DOM package. And then down here inside our component, we're going to say const search equals useLocation. And this search thing is basically the string that contains all of the query parameters. So what we're going to have to do, this is just basic vanilla JavaScript here. We're just going to say const month index equals, and we're going to say new URL search params search dot get, and then we basically put in the name of whatever query parameter we're looking for. So if we're looking for the month, we're just going to name that M. And for the year index, we're going to do the same thing, right? And we can just call that year and month. I'm not quite sure why I called it index. So we'll say const year equals new URL search params search dot get year. Okay, so what we're going to do next, we're not going to delete this today thing, but what we are going to do is use that as the default if there are no query parameters specified in our application. So what that's going to look like, inside the parentheses of this use state hook, we're going to check and see if the month and year actually exist, right? These will not exist if these query parameters weren't specified. And the way we can do that is by saying month and year, and then we can use a ternary operator to determine their value. So if the month and year both exist, that means we've specified both in the query parameters, and we can say moment, and we'll create a new moment from the month and the year, just like we saw before. So we'll say month and year, and tell it how to parse. We're going to say month, month, year, 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 year. Okay, so that's if the month and year exist. If they don't, we want the default to be the current date. So for that, we just say today. Okay? And that's how we do it. So just to test this out, let's actually go back, and first of all, we need to change the name of this. We're going to say query params calendar controller. And we're going to import that instead. We're going to say import query params calendar controller, and change this one to that, query params calendar controller. And let's make sure our app is running with npm run start. And what we're going to see is that if we go up here and add some query parameters, like I mentioned before, right? Let's say month equals 08. Or you know what? Let's do, I don't know. Let's try July 1999. Why not? We'll say 07 ampersand, and we'll say year equals 1999. Hit enter. And sure enough, we see that that brings up July 1999 in our calendar, and that everything works from there. But one thing to notice is that as we click previous and next, the query parameters aren't actually kept in sync with the current selected month. So in order to get that to happen, we're going to have to go back to our query params calendar controller, and we're going to have to change our increment month and decrement month functions to basically set those as the changes occur. So what that's going to look like is, instead of just setting our current month moment right away, we're actually going to assign this new moment, right, which is 1 month in the future, or 1 month after the current month. We're going to assign that to a constant, which we'll call new month equals moment, blah, blah, blah. And then we're going to call history.push with the new query parameters corresponding to that new month. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to say history.push question mark m equals, and we're going to insert the new month here, so we'll want to use backticks for this actually. Okay, we're going to insert the new month dot format mm. So that'll give us the 2-number format for the month. And then we're going to add the year, so we'll say ampersand y equals, and then we'll get the year representation of our new month by saying new month dot format y. Okay, and finally, after that, we're going to call our set current month moment to the new month. Okay, so that should handle incrementing the month. We're going to do the same thing for decrementing the month by basically saying new month equals current month moment dot subtract 1 month. Okay, we're going to set our current month moment to the new month. But before that, we're going to set our new history, which we can just copy and paste that, and that will update the query parameters for us. All right, and that should be all we need to do. So let's go take a look. Oops, and we need to actually use the use history hook. I was getting ahead of myself using this history.push thing. So let's go into here. We're going to say use location and also import use history. And down here, what we're going to do is say const history equals use history. And that should get rid of that error for us. So what we should see now, right, if we go to July 1999, if we click on next, we'll see that the query parameters up here automatically update to reflect what's being displayed in the calendar here. All right, so now that we've built out a very reusable calendar component, the next thing that you'll probably want to do is make it look good by adding some styles. So what is the best way to do that? Well, we could use CSS modules as we've seen before, but I'm actually going to show you a different way of adding styles to our components, and that is by using a package called styled components in React. Okay, so essentially styled components are just a different way of adding styles to our React elements in JSX. Basically, instead of defining each of our elements as, let's say, a div with a class name that corresponds to some kind of CSS class, what we do instead is we actually define all of the styles as their own component element. So here's what I mean by that, right? Instead of saying div class name blah 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 with all of the styles or with a class name inside of there, what we do with styled components is we actually define a styled element as a component. So we might say something like const red button, and the syntax for this is going to be something like styled.button. We'll discuss that in just a minute here. And we actually write the styles inside a string here. So we would say something like background color, red, right? Or something like that. And then what we would do is we would actually display this button inside JSX by saying something like red button. And then we would have some text that would say something like don't click. And we would just use that red button in the same way that we use other React components that we create. So styled components, the nice part about them is that they really, in my opinion, make your code more readable, right? Because instead of having, button, class name equals red button or whatever, you can just define that and actually display that as the element. So I like styled components a lot, and that's why we're going to be using them here to add styles to our calendar. So to get started with this, let's actually install the styled components package, and we can do that by saying npm install styled-components and hit enter. And let's open up our calendar component now and define some of those styles up here. But first, let's actually get all of these other utility functions out of here, just to make it a little cleaner. So what I'm going to do is create a new file called util.js. I'm going to just copy and paste all of the calendar utilities into there, including days of the week, pad week back, pad week front, etc. We're just going to copy all of those and put them into our util file. Okay, and since we're exporting all of these, well, let's actually make sure to export these ones too. We'll say export const, and export const. All right, and then we just have to import those into our calendar here. So we'll say import get days in month, segment into weeks, days of the week, and pad week front and back. So pad week front, pad week back. We're importing those from the utility file that we just created. Okay, so let's make sure everything worked out there first, just by running npm run start to make sure we didn't miss any imports or anything. And it looks like I did mess something up. That should just be /util since it's in the same directory as before. So let's just refresh this now, and everything looks like it's working just as it was before. Cool, so let's go back now, and what we're going to do is add some styles using the styled components package. So what this is going to look like is we're going to say import styled from styled components. And once we've done that, we're going to define the styled components that we want to display inside our calendar component here. So the first one that we're going to define, and I'm just going to code it out initially. I'll show you how to use it in a minute. We're going to start off here by saying const calendar controls wrap. Okay, so this will be basically the section that includes the current month, the previous button, the next button, etc. Styled.div, this basically just uses the div element as the starting point for our styles. And then we put 2 backticks after it, which, you know, might look a little strange to a lot of you, but this is just how styled components does things. So the styles for this div, really the only thing that we're going to do is set its height at 15% of whatever the container is. So that'll just make sure that it takes up the top portion correctly of our calendar. All right, and after that, what we're going to do is we're going to define our calendar controls. So let's say calendar controls equals styled.div. Again, we're using the div as a starting point. And inside this string here, what we're going to do is say margin auto, max width, we'll say 400 pix. And what this is doing is just making sure that the calendar controls are displayed in the center of the calendar. And we're also going to say text align center. And you'll see what all this looks like shortly as well. And then we're going to say that buttons inside our calendar controls are going to have width of 45%. And they'll have a margin of 0 and 2%. Okay, you'll see what that looks like shortly. All right, so we have our calendar controls wrap and our calendar controls already set up. So let me show you how to actually insert these styled components into our JSX. Essentially, all we have to do is use this name as a tag and put it wherever we want inside the JSX. So for our controls, what we would want to do is say calendar controls wrap, and we would have our actual calendar controls section here. So we'd say calendar controls, and then we're going to just insert the H1 and buttons into that container. And essentially the styles that we defined up above are going to be applied to both of these elements. So this would be the same, more or less, as if we were to say div class name equals calendar controls wrap, all right, and define this class in a separate CSS file. Okay, and then, you know, we would define another div for calendar controls. So again, I personally just find this way of doing things easier. So let's go take a look now at what this is going to look like. Okay, so we see that our calendar controls are now being displayed nicely in the center of the page with the previous and next button looking a little better. They could look better though, so let's just go add some quick styles for our buttons inside our index.css. We'll just say that we want all of our buttons here to have a background color of black, to have a border none, to have a border radius of something like 8 pix. We'll say color white, cursor pointer, font size will be something like 16 pix, and padding will also be 16 pix. Okay, so that'll just apply to all of the buttons in our application. And if we go back now and take a look at our app, and you might have to refresh, I'm not sure why the buttons look like that initially, but we should see now that our previous and next button are looking much nicer than they were before, okay? So we've got the styling set up for the controls of our calendar component. Let's actually style this table now. This one's gonna be a little bit in depth, so just follow along with me, and you can always feel free to copy and paste these finished styled components from GitHub if you want to. So what we're going to do is after our calendar controls, we're going to define another styled component here, which we'll call calendar table. This will just contain the entire table. And we're going to say equals styled.div. Okay, so we're actually going to be using a div instead of a table here. We're just going to be replacing it for styling purposes. And inside here, the styling is going to be height 85%. Display is going to be flex, so we're going to be using a flex box here. We're going to say flex direction column, since we're going to be displaying each of the rows inside this calendar table first. And what we're going to do is say width 100%. So basically, the calendar table here is going to take up the entire space of whatever container it's inside of. Width-wise, that is. Height-wise, it's only going to take up 85% because the other 15% is from the calendar controls. Okay, so that's our calendar table. Let's add some styles for our calendar row, and for that we're going to add another styled component. So we'll say const calendar row equals styled.div. So we're using a div for this one as well. And this one is going to be display flex and flex 1. So that will make the calendar row its own flex container here, as well as make it take up an equal amount of space inside the calendar table container, which it will be inside of. All right, and next up we're going to have our calendar table wrap component. Basically, this is just going to be some specific styling for this calendar table component up here. And actually, let's just define that up above. So we'll say const calendar table wrap equals styled.div. And inside here, the styles are going to be, we're going to say position absolute, top 0, right 0, left 0, and bottom 0. Again, this is just stuff for making sure the calendar table takes up its desired space. Don't worry too much about what I'm doing here if you don't understand it. Next up, we're going to define our calendar heading. So let's say const calendar heading equals styled.div. And inside here, we're going to give it two simple styles. It's going to be display flex and flex direction row. Next up, we're going to have our calendar heading cell, which is going to be a div as well. So style.div. Inside here, we'll say flex 1 and text align center. And next up, we're going to define styles for the actual cells of our calendar. So the first one here will be a calendar cell wrap, which will be a div. And the styles here are going to be padding 0 pix, flex 1. And last but not least, let's define some styling for each of our calendar cells. So what we're going to do is just say const cell equals styled.div. And inside here, we're going to say border 1 pix solid, and we'll just make it a very light gray color. And then we're going to say position relative, height 100%. And we'll make it so that when we hover the mouse over each of our calendar cells, the background color of that cell changes. We'll make it that same light gray color, I suppose. So we'll just say EEE. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to wrap this entire thing inside a calendar table wrap. Okay, that component that we created before. So let's put everything inside of there. And indent it. And the next thing we're going to do is change this table to our calendar table style component we just created. We're going to change the T head to calendar heading. We're going to actually delete this table row here and just display each of our cells. So we'll say calendar heading cell. And we have to change the closing tag of that as well. Calendar heading cell. And we'll change the closing tag here to calendar heading. And now for the actual body of our table, what this is going to look like, we can actually just remove the T body since we won't need that anymore. Right? We're using divs now, so we don't actually need the head body distinction. So we're going to say calendar table. And for each of these, we're going to change it to calendar row and calendar row. And for the display week, what we're going to do is basically wrap all of this inside a calendar cell wrap. So we'll say calendar cell wrap and display the day moment and all of that other logic inside of it. So we'll close that off here with a closing tag. Calendar cell wrap. Okay, and we'll remove those. And we need to add another closing parenth there. One last thing, we need to change these TDs to a calendar cell. Okay, and we'll go through here, change that to calendar cell, and same thing for this one, calendar cell, and calendar cell. All right, so that was kind of tedious, I will admit. But now that we have everything converted over, in my opinion, it's a lot easier to tell what's what. And if you want to know what the styling for any of these components is, you can just go up to the top and take a look at it directly. All right, so let's take a look at our app, and it looks like I have an error there, so let's just go up here. Oh, I just called this cell. Let's call this calendar cell. Calendar cell. Okay, so let's go back now and take a look. And sure enough, we see that our calendar is looking pretty darn nice, right? Every time we hover over one of these days, it changes the background color of the cell, and we can go from date to date. So our calendar is actually looking like a real calendar that you might find on a real website. And in the process, we also got to see the basics of how styled components work. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.